What's going on, guys? It's Danny from Fantasy Stock Exchange here, and today I'll be going through round 3 of my contextualized game log series I'm doing over here at the Fantasy Stock Exchange YouTube channel, where I'm basically going through the seasons of some of the top selected players in 2022 fantasy football and painting the picture as to what we can take away from these 2021 campaigns. Again, the purpose of this video, the purpose of this series is to isolate out any extraneous variables that we can find from their 2021 output and ultimately paint a picture as to what can we expect coming into 2022. The one thing I want to reiterate is that this should be used in conjunction with all the other resources you have available and not to be taken at face value. More so, as I said, to paint the picture as to what 2021 looked like for these players. First and second rounds are already available on the YouTube channel in the description. So if you guys want to follow along some of the top 24 selected players, make sure you go watch those videos as well after this one. All ADP data from today's video is going to be coming from Underdog Fantasy. So if you guys disagree with some of these third round selections, it is all pulled from Underdog. Promo code FSU gets you 100% match back on first deposit up to $100, as well as access to our rankings manifesto to help you guys prepare for your fantasy drafts. Another thing, all the player cards from today's video are going to be posted over on Patreon. Gladster or Tone Setter tier gets you full access to each and every one of these player cards. Planning on doing over 50. So if you guys don't want to miss out on these player cards, access them before your fantasy drafts this upcoming season. Make sure you go sign up over on Patreon. But before we get into 301, as always, we're going to hit the intro. All right, starting off at the 301, the first player going in the third round on Underdog Fantasy is Nick Chubb, running back from the Cleveland Browns. And with Nick Chubb, there's really no splits that I can take away from his season. And we realized that the only pattern for his fantasy output that we can really follow is games in which he scores a touchdown, which, as we know, for most running backs that don't get a lot of receiving work, that is going to be the case. So nothing I can really pull away here. Nick Chubb, we know in real life, is one of the best NFL runners, but ultimately for fantasy football, he's going to hold less value due to the nature of the way he plays. He's not going to have, 50, 60, 70 targets. He's probably going to be a 35, 40 target back. So his output, his variance is going to solely come on the basis of how many touchdowns he can score and what games his touchdowns come in. So no real takeaway from Nick Chubb at 301, but 302 is a juicy one and a hot topic in fantasy football. Ultimately, a superstar wide receiver that was traded this offseason. Let's go on to the 302 and A.J. Brown, newly of the Philadelphia Eagles. The contextualized game logs that I pulled here are games in which A.J. Brown was fully healthy in 2021. As we know, the talent is clearly there, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, but he's coming off a relatively disappointing 2021 campaign by his own standards. He was drafted similar area last year, 2-3 turn, but he failed to record a top 24 point per game season, dealing with multiple injuries throughout the year. But as we know, he was battling a variation of hamstring, knee, and chest injuries throughout the season and missed 3 games while also being hindered in others. The purpose of his contextualized game logs, as I said, is to try to isolate out the games in which he was deemed fully healthy in. And once we isolate out those games, there was 10 games in the sample. How did he perform? But you guys can see on the screen, 16.4 PPR points per game for Brown, a wide receiver 11 pace across the season. And we saw the actual peripherals of the situation look fantastic. A 29.57% target market share and was extremely efficient on the targets he got. So yeah, 16.4 PPR points per game is very nice, but what I'm looking at is the efficiency, and what I'm looking at is his ability to command targets, which 29.57% is an elite target share. Moving to the Eagles this offseason, I think he should be locked and loaded to bounce back from a fantasy football perspective, and I would be extremely shocked if he doesn't finish inside the top 12 to 15 wide receivers in fantasy football for 2022. 303 off the board currently is Chargers wide receiver Keenan Allen. And because his teammate is actually going in this round, I'm just going to group them together. So the contextualized game log I want to point out is Keenan Allen versus Mike Williams splits post bye week for the Chargers. So week 7 was their bye week. Ultimately, the reason why I want to do this is that the Chargers points per game from offense jumped from 24.7 to 29.6 after the Chargers bye week. And we can see in those games after the bye week, yes, Mike Williams had a great start to the season, but Keenan Allen was clearly the wide receiver one for LA down the stretch. And I actually posted a tweet for their comparison, but down the stretch, week 7 on, we saw it. Keenan Allen, 25.96 target share, nearly 10 targets per game, and a 17.1 PPR point per game pace, which would have actually ranked wide receiver 10 across a full season. Mike Williams was trailing behind quite significantly, only an 18 or so percent target share, and ultimately 12.6 PPR points per game, which stretched across the year is wide receiver 31. The reason why I kind of wanted to bring them together is that there's only a 4-pick gap between these guys on Underdog right now. And I've seen some analysts that went out there and said, I would rather Mike Williams going into 2022. But the numbers speak for themselves. If Keenan Allen is on the field, Keenan Allen is the number one look for Justin Herbert, and Keenan Allen should be the most prioritized LA Chargers wide receiver. Obviously, a team that we want to stack, a high-powered offense that we want access to, but gun to your head, if you have to make the choice, third round, it's a no debate. It's Keenan Allen for me, and not even particularly close. The player going directly after Keenan Allen on Underdog Fantasy right now is currently Michael Pittman Jr., wide receiver from the Indianapolis Colts. And realistically, the only takeaway I have is that in week 15, he got suspended, or he got, ejected for the second half against New England. 1 catch for 7 yards in the first half. If you exclude this game, where obviously out of his control, he can't control what happened in that situation, it's not really projectable to say, he's going to get, ejected from a game every single season. But we do see his seasonal line: 87 receptions, 1,075 yards, and 6 touchdowns in 16 games, rise him from 14 PPR points per game to nearly 15 PPR points per game. Easily one of the best breakout candidate wide receivers going into his third season. We could ultimately see Michael Pittman not only build off these numbers last year with Matt Ryan in town, potentially explode into an Allen Robinson type player for the foreseeable future. I wouldn't be shocked if Michael Pittman was a second round fantasy pick this time next year. The next player is going to be superstar running back Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints. The reason why he's going at the 305 point blank is that we are not sure of his playing status. He may get 6 games, 4 games. He may play the whole season. We do not know over a dispute this offseason. So ultimately here, as soon as he gets announced, if he's announced tomorrow that he's expected to play for the full season, this guy's going to be jumping way back up in terms of ADP. But let's look at what his 2021 season looked like apart from this potential suspension he'll face. For Alvin Kamara, the biggest situational context that we can find in his splits is the games with and without starting quarterback Jameis Winston in the lineup. And for this situation, for this offense, once Winston got hurt, this offense completely plummeted, and Kamara was really disappointing down the stretch from a fantasy perspective comparative to where we were taking him in fantasy drafts last year. How does Kamara's season look once we just isolate it to the games that Winston started? And you guys can see on the screen, but Alvin Kamara jumped first 7 games up till week 8 was a 19.6 PPR point per game score. Following that stretch, he was only scoring at about a 16 PPR point per game clip. Kamara scored 6 of his 9 seasonal touchdowns in the stretch when Jameis Winston was his quarterback. And as I mentioned, outpaced his splits by nearly 3.5 fantasy points per game. Hopefully with a full year with Winston in this offense, I expect them to take that next step. A team that, with Winston under center, averaged 25.14 points per game and dropped to 18.9 points per game once Winston got hurt. I think they can recapture that 2021 glimmer. Obviously, Michael Thomas coming back to this offense, Chris Olave coming back to this offense, maybe potential 11 personnel added with the addition of Jarvis Landry as well. We could see this offense really stretch a defense out. And if that's the case, as we know with Alvin Kamara, he gets all of the valuable touches we could possibly want. He gets the touches through the air in terms of his targets, and he gets those coveted goal line touches, arguably the best goal line back we have seen in the last 10 years. So with Alvin Kamara, as soon as he gets announced that, oh, he's playing this season, or, oh, he's getting, a 2 or 4 game suspension, I expect his value to go up. I feel like he's only getting suppressed to the 3rd round right now due to the uncertainty around his legal situation. But If you're able to get Alvin Kamara in the third round of your draft, say you're drafting early, I am more than fine taking that risk because I do think he's got that league-winning upside, as I mentioned, with what should be an up-and-coming offense with these New Orleans Saints. The next player in ADP is going to be quarterback one from last year, Josh Allen, and the only context we can really point to is his production sans that snow blizzard game. If you guys were watching last year, game against the New England Patriots, where the conditions were just not conducive for a passing offense. And ultimately, Allen saw his second worst fantasy performance of the year in that game. If you isolate that game out of his stretch last year, he jumps from 24.1 4-point passing touchdowns point per game to nearly 25 fantasy point per game in 4-point passing touchdown leagues. So I just think it's a no-brainer. Josh Allen is the ranked quarterback one this year. He is an elite passer from NFL perspective. He can cross 40 passing touchdowns while ultimately providing you upwards of 600, 700 rushing yards and potentially, 6 to 8 rushing touchdowns. So from a pure dual threat, Konami level, high upside passing perspective, he's got the whole package for what we should want from a fantasy quarterback. And if you have to take the plunge, if you have to draft him in the third round, I think that's more than a fine spot for the stud himself, number 17, Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. The next player in ADP is going to be wide receiver from the Carolina Panthers, DJ Moore. And the splits that I want to pull here, quite frankly, are splits that he had last year with adequate quarterback play. Again, this is a small sample size. You guys are going to rip it in the comments. So be it. But DJ Moore, to me, in the past few years, has been that classic player that has really embodied the what-if hypothetical. It's clear, again, he is uber talented. He's one of probably the top 12 to 15 at worst talents at the wide receiver position in the entire NFL. But given his talent, given his ability to command targets, when are we going to see that top 10 wide receiver season? The biggest hurdle for him, again, has been quarterback play. It hasn't just been, inadequate or slightly below average. It's arguably been in contention for the worst quarterback play in the entire NFL. With former Browns quarterback Baker Mayfield coming in, we could potentially see Moore finally get the quarterback upgrade he deserves. And again, as I mentioned, for his contextualized game logs, we'll look at DJ Moore's splits before and after the collapse of Sam Darnold in 2021. We saw last year, first 4 games of the season with DJ Moore, Sam Darnold looked like a competent quarterback. Carolina got off to a hot start. Carolina's offense was moving the ball and scoring efficiently. In that stretch, Sam Darnold scored 10 total touchdowns to only 6 total turnovers in those first 4 games. The rest of the season, we saw that ratio go from 10 to 6 to ultimately 4 total touchdowns to 11 total turnovers down the stretch from Sam Darnold. How did DJ Moore look? Well, for starters, as you guys can see on the screen, he was the wide receiver 27 PPR points per game, 14.0 across the season. But when you isolate that stretch, that hot start that he had with adequate quarterback play, we see a dominant overall wide receiver, nearly a 30% target share and 22.4 PPR points per game, which across a year would have been the wide receiver 2. Again, don't take these numbers too hard. Don't say, oh, well, this is a small sample size. We can't project this across the season. I get it. The reason why I'm excited about this is that we see the ability to commit targets. It's not just going to be a sample size affected by, a couple big 70-yard touchdowns. He's commanding targets. He's efficient on those targets. And ultimately, we saw when the offense is, again, conducive from a passing perspective to support DJ Moore, he can be amongst the elite of the elite at the wide receiver position. If Baker Mayfield plays at or above expectations, not only can he pay off at his ADP in terms of DJ Moore, wide receiver 14 ADP, he can downright smash his ADP. I can see a potential scenario where this offense is cooking. Baker Mayfield comes back after that collarbone severely hindered him last year, and DJ Moore has a top 5 overall wide receiver season. That is in the range of outcomes. Don't let he hasn't been a top 15 wide receiver. Why are we ranking him there narrative? Because the talent is there. The quarterback upgrade hopefully is finally there. And if all of those hit, this is a guy that can be selected in the top 15 of fantasy drafts going into 2023. Next player in terms of ADP on Underdog Fantasy is Kyle Pitts, tight end from the Atlanta Falcons. And really, there's no distinguishable splits when it comes to Pitts' rookie season. The one that we can maybe look at, but I really think is a fugaz, is his splits with and without Calvin Ridley in the lineup. With Calvin Ridley in the lineup, he scored about 14 PPR points per game and only scored 9.25 PPR points per game without Ridley in the lineup. but we can assume the presence of a top 10 selected receiver with Drake London will more than likely supplement the loss of Ridley in terms of offensive output for the Atlanta Falcons. So, in terms of Kyle Pitts, I'm more than fine betting on uber talented elite player at the age of 22 to ultimately have the potential to be up there with Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews going into next season. The next player we're going to be talking about in this series is going to be James Conner, currently selected at the 310 on Underdog Fantasy. We see the general story of his season last year, RB9 PPR points per game, 17.2 across the season. But the main contextualized game log we're going to look at here is his splits without Chase Edmonds in the lineup. And we see with Chase Edmonds' departure to the Miami Dolphins this offseason, we can really look at how Conner performed as the sole back of this Cardinals backfield. And he was downright a monster in the stretch that Chase Edmonds missed. Again, I am a little bit nervous, as I'll get into, in terms of projecting these splits going forward into 2022. But as we see, he was a near 26 PPR point per game scorer in the stretch on the back of 10 touchdowns scored in these 7 games. And we saw him used very highly in the receiving game, 32 targets or 6.4 targets per game with Edmonds out of the lineup. He can downright be a bell cow running back if this usage from last year can carry over. Obviously, these splits are phenomenal, but I am hesitant to anoint Conner to these splits with Edmonds out of town because, again, the Cardinals brought in 6th-round rookie running back Keontae Ingram, who's a smooth player. He can contribute on third downs, can maybe develop into that Chase Edmonds light type of replacement. And ultimately, with former Chief Darrell Williams getting into the mix this offseason as well in terms of their signings, he showed last year when Clyde Edwards-Helaire showed an inability to get it done, Darrell Williams was relied upon for the Chiefs. So with James Conner, it's kind of just betting on, a subpar player with potential competition behind him to repeat a historical stretch that he showed last year to carry over next year. I think 3rd round's a fine ADP for him, but if you're saying, oh, he's going to smash his ADP, oh, he's going to be, such a value this year, I am slightly hesitant to rank him above, obviously, the other running backs we mentioned on yesterday's video in a guy like Leonard Fournette, Javonte Williams, etc. Some of those 2-3 turn backs that we are seeing. The next player at 311 is realistically a player that I can't pull any contextualized game logs for. I can't recount their 2021 season. Reason being, 2nd-year running back Travis Etienne out of the Jacksonville Jaguars did not play a single regular season game in 2021 in his rookie season. Obviously, with that preseason season-ending Lisfranc injury to his foot, we just don't have a sample to base off of for 2021. One of my favorite breakout candidates, if he's healthy going into the year, I think he can definitely pay off at this 311 ADP. But for his contextualized game logs, we can't pull any because he didn't have any. The final player of the video that I want to get into is going to be wide receiver Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. And for Courtland Sutton's contextualized game logs, again, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at how the presence of Jerry Jeudy really affected his bottom line in 2021. And you guys can see it was already a disappointing season. Wide receiver 60 in terms of PPR points per game, 8.8 in that number in all 17 games that he played last year. But Jerry Jeudy on the field, he already had a disappointing 8.8 PPR points per game. That number just halved. He averaged 4.4 PPR points per game, which would have ranked outside of the top 100 last year across a full season. A guy like Isaiah Ford was outproducing the number that Courtland Sutton was when the presence of Jerry Jeudy was on the field. If this was just, chalk up the bad quarterback play, the usage was there, but ultimately we should see some positive regression, I'd be more willing to accept these. However, it's not only that he didn't produce, he didn't command targets. A 13.4% target share in the games that he shared with Jerry Jeudy. He was just straight up alpha. And I get it, and I'm fully understanding if you want to invest in what should be an up-and-coming Broncos offense, the addition of Russell Wilson, one of the best quarterbacks in the league, eventually making all ancillary assets, all ancillary pieces to this offense outperform what they did last year drastically. But I would much rather trust an oncoming 3rd-year breakout candidate with Jerry Jeudy, who straight up alphaed Courtland Sutton last year, rather than Courtland Sutton himself. Courtland Sutton, in my opinion, should not be going above Jerry Jeudy. I feel like there's a preconceived bias there, a preconceived narrative that because Russell Wilson loved the big-bodied receiver that DK Metcalf was, that ultimately Courtland Sutton's automatically going to play that role. But that's not how it works. DK Metcalf is a superstar level player, whereas Courtland Sutton, is probably a fine number 2 type of wide receiver. I think Jerry Jeudy's got the upside that people are really explaining for when it comes to Courtland Sutton. So ultimately, instead of betting, as I mentioned, a 27-year-old wide receiver coming off by far his worst full season as a pro, I would much rather take the plunge, take the bet on Jerry Jeudy in this same offense. But off of Courtland Sutton, appreciate you guys for sticking around for the entire third round of the contextualized game log series. We're going to be bringing forth round 4 next week. So if you guys are interested and want to follow along the series, make sure you leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel. As I'm recording this, we're about 5 subscribers off of 12K. So if we haven't already hit it by the time this video goes live, make sure you help us in our cause to getting that 12K and keep growing this channel. We're about to head into a busy August month. So stay tuned, get ready for your fantasy drafts, and dominate with the help of us over here at FSC. But either way, appreciate you guys for sticking around. Enjoy your weekend. Peace out.